The date was October 13th, 1972. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a Fairchild FH-227D, nicknamed the Lead Sled, was cutting through the thin, turbulent air of the Andes Mountains. Inside, 45 people were laughing, shouting, and throwing rugby balls down the aisle. They were young, mostly in their early 20s, members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, heading to a match in Santiago, Chile. To Captain Julio Ferradas and his co-pilot Dante Laguerra, it was a routine charter, even if the devil's backbone below was hidden by a thick, suffocating blanket of white clouds. But suddenly the laughter died. The plane hit a pocket of air so violent it felt like the hand of God had slapped the fuselage toward the earth. In the next 60 seconds, this celebration of youth would become a struggle for survival that redefined the very limits of the human soul. Imagine you are in a place where there is no one to hear your scream, where the air itself is a thief that steals the heat from your lungs with every breath. Imagine a world where hunger makes you stare at the frozen remains of your best friends, not with horror, but with a predatory, hollow desperation. This was not a nightmare. It was the visceral reality for 16 young men who spent 72 days in a white hell. They were 12,000 feet up, trapped in a jagged cathedral of ice, where the silence is so loud it makes the mind invent voices just to fill the void. This story is famous for what they ate to stay alive, but the real mystery is how they found the will to live when every star in the sky told them they were already dead. The mountains were not just a location. They were an active, predatory enemy. The Andes is an unforgiving place for those who underestimate the aesthetics of agony. While the world eventually called it a miracle, for those on the mountain, it was a slow, rhythmic descent into a different kind of existence. They were driving on the rims of their sanity from the first hour. Most survival stories end in the first 3 days because people make the fatal error of waiting for a rescue that isn't coming. These boys didn't just wait, they evolved. They formed what they called the Society of the Fuselage, a miniature civilization built on the wreckage of their former lives. Friends, have you ever thought about what happens when all the hope in your life is stripped away and only the white, blinding glare of death is visible in every direction? The crash was only the beginning of the horror. When the plane clipped the ridge, the right wing tore off like paper, spinning away into the mist. A second later, the left wing followed, and the fuselage became a high-speed toboggan, slamming into a snowbank at 200 miles per hour. The seats tore from the floor, crushing passengers against the cockpit bulkhead in a tangle of screaming metal and bone. But the strange thing is, for a moment after the impact, there was a peace so profound it felt holy. Then the screaming started. The cold rushed in. At 12,000 feet, the temperature drops so fast it feels like a physical weight pressing on your chest. They were dressed in blazers and loafers, equipped for a weekend of rugby and parties, not for the most hostile environment on the planet. By the time the sun began to set on that first day, 5 people were already dead, and many more were mangled beyond recognition. They huddled inside the broken remains of the cabin, using luggage to plug the gaping hole where the tail used to be. But the wind was a needle, stitching through every crack, turning their sanctuary into a freezer. No one had ever survived a crash like this in the high Cordillera. The search teams in Chile and Uruguay immediately took to the air, but from 5,000 feet up, a white plane against white snow is invisible. It is a speck of salt on a wedding cake. The survivors watched the planes fly over, their hearts leaping with a hope that was destined to be crushed. They tried to make a cross out of suitcases. They tried to use lipstick to write SOS on the roof, but the mountains simply swallowed their efforts. What would you have done in those first nights, listening to the moans of the dying while your own feet turned black from frostbite? The first week was a lesson in scarcity. There was no food, only a few bars of chocolate and some bottles of wine. They rationed it down to a single capful of wine and a sliver of chocolate a day. But the hunger was nothing compared to the thirst. In the high altitude, your body dries out like a piece of leather. They had to invent a way to melt snow, using the metal backs of the seats to catch the sun's rays. It was a navigation miracle that they found any water at all. Yet as the days turned into a week, the realization began to rot their minds. The world had stopped looking for them. In his journal, one of the survivors noted that the mountains were beautiful, even as they were killing them. This was the start of their psychological evolution. They began to see the savage beauty of the sunset reflecting off the peaks, a crimson glow that looked like blood on the snow. It was a morbid curiosity that kept them upright. If they were going to die, they decided they would die as witnesses to a glory no one else would ever see. But the beauty was a mask. Beneath the snow, the mountain was preparing its next move. Just as they thought they had stabilized their tiny society, a sound like a freight train echoed from the peaks above. The silence was about to be broken by a new kind of hell. Would you have stayed in that fuselage, or would you have run into the void? The answer would determine who lived to see the spring and who would become part of the mountain forever. Imagine you are in a place where the sun is your greatest enemy and the silence is loud enough to break your ribs. Picture a world where the laws of God and man have frozen solid, leaving you with a choice that no soul should ever have to make. On October 13, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227D carrying 45 people vanished into the heart of the Andes. For the rest of the world, they were dead, names etched into memorial stones. But for those trapped at 11,000 feet, the story was just beginning. This is not a story about a plane crash. This is a story about the day the survivors stopped looking for a way out and started looking for the beauty in hell. Because in the thin air of the Cordillera, they discovered a terrifying truth. To save your body, you must first lose your mind. The fuselage was no longer a piece of a plane. It had become a cramped, shivering cathedral of the desperate. Outside, the Andes stretched out in every direction like a frozen lunar landscape, beautiful and utterly indifferent to the 45 souls gasping for oxygen. By day 10, the initial shock had begun to rot into a visceral reality that no one was coming to save them. The search had been called off, a fact they heard through a small transistor radio that hissed with the static of a world that had already moved on. Hunger was no longer a sharp pain. It was a hollow, echoing void that started to eat them from the inside out. In this thin air, the Society of the Fuselage was born, a primitive but sophisticated laboratory of survival where a rugby team used the broken wing to catch sunlight and melt snow into water. But water cannot stop the body from consuming its own muscle. It was on this day that the sacred pact was whispered into existence among the shadows of the wreckage. They looked at each other, friends, teammates, brothers, and made a vow that would haunt history. They agreed that if they died, the others must use their bodies to live. It was a spiritual contract signed in the silence of the white hell. But the mountain was not finished with its lessons in humility. Just as they adjusted to the hunger, the horizon began to hum with a low, predatory vibration. To survive the Andes, you had to find beauty in the jagged peaks, but the peaks were about to descend upon them in a roar of white powder and suffocating darkness. Would you have been able to look at your best friend and see only a means of survival, or would the silence of the tomb have claimed you first? The date was October 13th, 1972. Fairchild Flight 571 was carrying 45 people, including a young rugby team, across the spine of the Andes Mountains. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was one of routine comfort and youthful energy. Friends were laughing, passing around a rugby ball, and glancing out at the sun-drenched peaks of the Blue Mirage. To Captain Ferradas, it was just another standard crossing, a mundane flight through a clear sky. But suddenly, the plane entered a thick bank of clouds, and the routine tranquility was shattered by a violent jolt. The pilots had made a fatal error in navigation, believing they had already passed the peaks when they were actually flying directly into them. Suddenly, the clouds parted to reveal a black wall of rock just yards from the cockpit window. The roar of the engines screaming at full throttle replaced the quiet hum of the cabin. 18,000 feet above the world, the Iron Bird began to fall. The right wing clipped a mountain ridge, shearing off with a sound like 1,000 car crashes, followed instantly by the left wing. In the next 60 seconds, this peaceful scene became a struggle for survival that defied all logic. The fuselage, now a hollow metal tube, slammed into a steep glacier at 200 miles per hour. It didn't explode, it slid. It hissed down the snow like a high-speed sled, internal seats ripping from the floor and crushing passengers against the cockpit bulkhead. The deceleration was so violent that bones snapped like dry twigs, and the air was filled with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the metallic tang of blood. When the sliding finally stopped, a deafening silence settled over the wreckage. No one had ever survived an impact at this altitude in such a desolate place. The survivors stepped out into a world of blinding white and thin, freezing air. They were 12,000 feet up, surrounded by jagged peaks that looked like the teeth of a giant. The wind was a low, predatory vibration, already beginning to steal the warmth from their bodies. This was the visceral reality of the Andes. Imagine you are in a place where there is no one to hear your scream, where the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight. Would you have looked at the wreckage and seen a tomb, or the beginning of a miracle? The cold here is not like a winter day. It is a clinical thief that seeks out every inch of exposed skin. By the time the sun began to dip behind the peaks, the temperature plummeted toward 30 degrees below zero. In his journal, one survivor would later write that the stars looked beautiful, but they felt like ice nails driven into the sky. The wreck was their only shelter, a jagged shell of aluminum that offered no insulation against the mountain's breath. They huddled together, using the bodies of the fallen to block the wind, learning the hard way that the mountains do not care about hope. But the real mystery was not the crash itself. It was what lay hidden in the cargo hold, supplies that were never meant for a glacier. As the first night fell, the group realized that the search planes flying overhead were looking at a white plane on white snow. They were invisible. This loneliness makes a person hollow from within, rotting the mind before the body. If the courage of these young men to face the first night is touching your heart, please hit the like button to support these stories of endurance. But the fire of their spirit was about to face a test much colder than the wind. Just as they began to organize, a low rumble echoed from the peaks above, a sound that signaled the mountains were not finished with them yet. Would you have been able to keep your sanity as the shadows stretched across the ice? The struggle had only just begun. The next morning, they looked out at a horizon that offered no trees, no animals, and no path home. They were driving on the rims of human capability, trapped in a savage beauty that was beautiful to look at, but lethal to touch. The blue mirage had become a white hell, and the silence of the tomb was waiting for the first one to blink. The date was October 12th, 1972. Inside the cabin of the Fairchild F-H227D, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the restless, infectious energy of youth. Members of the Old Christians Club rugby team were not just traveling, they were vibrating with the sheer thrill of a mountain holiday. To these young men, the Andes were not a graveyard, but a scenic backdrop for jokes and high-altitude pranks. They were tossing rugby balls down the aisle, flirting with the idea of adventure, and laughing at the sheer absurdity of a chartered flight to Santiago. There was an utter lack of premonition, a sense of invulnerability that only belongs to the young and the athletic. They saw the Iron Bird as a chariot, and the white peaks below as nothing more than a beautiful, distant mirage. Up in the cockpit, however, a fatal error was quietly unfolding in the silence of the clouds. Colonel Ferradas and Lieutenant Laguerrara were flying blind, trapped in a thick, milk-white fog that erased the horizon. They relied on dead reckoning, but their calculations were poisoned by a heavy headwind they hadn't fully accounted for. Believing they had already cleared the jagged spine of the Andes, they began their descent too early, turning the nose of the plane directly into the green hell of the hidden peaks. They were chasing a ghost of a runway that was still miles away, descending into a labyrinth of granite and ice that they couldn't even see. Suddenly, the cloud bank fractured for a microsecond, revealing a sight that turned their blood to ice. A black ridge of rock was rising up like a wall, directly in their path. The pilots roared the engines to life, attempting a desperate vertical escape, but the Fairchild was too heavy and the mountains were too high. The sound of the impact was not a cinematic explosion. It was the horrific screech of a giant zipper opening the world. The right wing clipped the ridge and sheared off, spinning away into the void, followed instantly by the tail section. In that heartbeat, the warmth of the cabin was replaced by the sudden, metallic taste of freezing air hitting warm lungs. The fuselage, now a hollowed-out tube of twisted metal, slammed onto the steep incline of a glacier. It didn't crumple immediately. Instead, it became a high-speed toboggan, hurtling down the ice at 200 miles per hour. Seats were ripped from their bolts, piling passengers against the cockpit bulkhead in a chaotic crush of bone and steel. The smell of hydraulic fluid masked the scent of cologne, and the youthful laughter was replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. The plane finally slammed into a wall of packed snow, coming to a dead halt in the middle of a vast, cosmic indifference. The screaming stopped, but the mountains were just beginning to speak. Would you have stayed inside that broken shell, or would you have stepped out into the blinding white? For the survivors, the normalcy of their lives had vanished in a single microsecond. They were no longer rugby players on a holiday. They were casualties of a navigation miracle gone wrong. As the sun began to dip below the peaks, the temperature plummeted, and the reality of their isolation began to sink in. They were thousands of feet above sea level, with no winter clothes, no food, and no way to signal the world they had left behind. The next morning would reveal the true scale of their prison, a place where the air is too thin to breathe and the silence is loud enough to drive a man insane. They had survived the crash, but they were about to learn that the Andes do not offer mercy to those who arrive uninvited. The wreckage sat like a discarded toy on the massive expanse of the glacier, a tiny speck of gray against a world of blinding white. The survivors huddled together, using the remnants of the cabin to shield themselves from a wind that felt like a physical weight against their skin. They were driving on the rims of their endurance from the very first hour. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a test of will. In this unforgiving place, the rules of civilization were stripping away, leaving only the primal urge to see the next sunrise. But as the first night fell, they realized that the blue mirage they had admired from the windows was now a cold, predatory reality. Would you have the strength to close your eyes in a place that wants you dead? The journey into the void had truly begun, and the price of survival was about to reach an unimaginable height. The transition from the hum of a pressurized cabin to the absolute, crushing silence of the crash site was the first thing that broke their spirits. For Captain Miller and the 23 survivors huddling in the jagged remains of the fuselage, the environment was no longer a backdrop. It had become a living, breathing antagonist. They looked out into the white expanse of the high Sierras, a place where the air is so thin it feels like breathing through a wet cloth. Every movement was a calculation of calories they didn't have to spare, and every breath was a reminder of the vacuum waiting to pull the warmth from their lungs. In his journal, the co-pilot later wrote that the silence was so loud it began to feel like a physical weight pressing against his temples. This is the stage of survival where the mind starts to play tricks, inventing the sound of distant rescue sirens or the smell of a home-cooked meal on the freezing wind. Dehydration began to set in within the first 12 hours, turning their tongues into pieces of dry sandpaper and making their throats click with every desperate swallow. They tried to eat the snow, but it was a fatal error that only lowered their core temperatures further, bringing them closer to the onset of hypothermia. Would you have had the discipline to sit still while your body screamed for movement? Or would you have wandered into the white void? By the second day, the clown show of their initial optimism had vanished, replaced by a visceral reality that nature was not cruel, but simply indifferent to their existence. The wreckage was a tomb of twisted metal, and as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, they realized the first night was merely a warning for the void that was coming. The internal silence of the Andes was more terrifying than the crash itself. As the first night descended, the temperature plummeted to minus 30 degrees, turning the remains of the Fairchild into a metal refrigerator. Marcelo Perez, the team captain, realized the weight of command had shifted from the playing field to a graveyard. He began the inventory of agony, moving between the rows of twisted seats to separate the living from the dead. Among the shadows lay Nando Parado, his skull fractured, drifting in a deep coma that everyone assumed was a prelude to his end. Beside him lay the frozen bodies of his mother and sister, yet Nando was unaware that his world had already ended. The survivors knew they could not stay in the open, so they began to construct the fuselage fortress. They used suitcases, broken seats, and even the clothes of the dead to plug the gaping hole where the tail had been torn away. This was the birth of the Society of the Fuselage, a primitive micro-civilization where every man had a role, and the only currency was survival. They huddled together in a space no larger than a small van, 30 people pressing their bodies against one another to steal enough warmth to keep their hearts beating. By the third day, a cruel irony set in: the thirst paradox. They were surrounded by millions of tons of water in the form of snow, but eating it only lowered their core temperature and cut their mouths. They were dying of dehydration in a frozen ocean. Adolfo Strauch looked at the wreckage and saw a solution. He took the aluminum backs from the seats and angled them toward the harsh mountain sun. By placing thin layers of snow on the metal, the reflected heat created a slow, agonizingly thin stream of life-sustaining water. It was a triumph of human resilience, a small victory in a landscape designed to kill them. But the most brutal blow came through the airwaves. They had managed to get a small transistor radio working, huddled around it like a holy relic. They waited for the news of their rescue, for the clown show of the search to finally find its target. Instead, they heard the cold, clipped voice of an announcer in Santiago. The search for the lost Uruguayan plane had been called off. The world had moved on. They were listening to their own death certificates being read aloud to them. In a corner of the wreck, a young man sat with his leg shattered, the bone white and jagged against the dark floor. With no medical supplies, he reached for a piece of jagged scrap metal and a length of wire. As the wind howled outside, he began to set his own bone, the metal biting into his skin while he bit into a leather wallet to keep from screaming. In the darkness, Marcelo found a single, small red child's shoe, a totem Nando's mother had brought for a nephew. He placed it on a ledge, a tiny spark of color in a world of gray and white. It was a promise that they would not stay here forever. But as the radio went silent, the crushing reality set in. If they were going to leave this hell, they would have to find a way to do it themselves. Would you have kept that radio on, hoping for a miracle? Or would you have smashed it to stop hearing the world forget you? The silence of the Andes is not the absence of sound, but the presence of an ancient, crushing weight that slowly hollows out the human spirit. By the 10th day, the survivors of Flight 571 were no longer just men. They were biological machines running out of fuel. Starvation is a deceptive killer, far different from the sharp agony of an injury. It begins as a gnawing, frantic animal in the pit of the stomach, but eventually that animal tires and falls asleep. A strange, painless lethargy began to settle over the fuselage. They felt light, almost as if they were floating above the snow, as their heart rate slowed and their bodies made a grim, internal calculation. When the stomach finds nothing to process, the body turns inward, beginning a process of self-cannibalization. This is the biological wall. They noticed it first in the small things, the way their skin began to flake like dry parchment, and how their eyes seemed to sink into their skulls. But the most terrifying realization came in the middle of the frozen nights. When they tried to relieve themselves, they saw a liquid that looked like dark coffee or motor oil. This black urine was the clinical sign of the end. Their bodies had finished burning every ounce of fat and were now systematically melting down their own muscle tissue to keep the brain and heart pulsing for just a few more hours. A great debate began to echo within the hollowed-out shell of the plane. It was a conversation that stripped away the veneer of civilization, leaving only the raw nerves of faith and survival. These were young men raised in the strict traditions of the Catholic Church, taught that the body was a temple and the dead were sacred. They sat in the dim light of the cabin, their breath hitching in the thin air, arguing over the definition of a soul. Some argued that to touch the fallen was a mortal sin that would damn them for eternity. Others, their voices raspy and weak, countered with a devastating question. Is it a larger sin to choose to live? Or is it the ultimate sin to let yourself die when the means of survival are right in front of you? Roberto Canessa, a medical student who understood the mechanics of the black urine better than anyone, knew they were hours away from a collective cardiac arrest. He realized that the dead were no longer their friends. They were the only bread available in this high-altitude desert. Imagine looking at your best friend and seeing only a chance to see your mother again. That is the moment the mind fractures and reforms into something unrecognizable. The group eventually reached a sacred pact, a survival treaty signed in the cold. If any of them died, the others had the right and duty to use their bodies so that the story of the group might reach the valley below. It was Canessa who finally stepped out into the blinding glare of the sun. Using a shard of broken glass from the windshield, he approached a body that had been preserved by the glacial cold. The meat was sun-dried, blackened by the ultraviolet rays, and frozen as hard as the stones beneath it. There was no joy in the act, only a mechanical, ritualistic necessity. As they partook in this grim communion, the atmosphere in the plains shifted from horror to a heavy, spiritual solemnity. They weren't eating the dead. They were inhaling the souls of their brothers to carry them home. They were turning the fallen into the very muscle and bone they needed to climb out of the grave, transforming a site of mass death into a laboratory of impossible life. But even as they found a way to fuel their bodies, the mountain was preparing a new way to break them. Would you have been the first to make that cut, knowing it was the only way to save the others? Or would you have waited for the black urine to claim you? The decision gave them a few more days of strength, but nature has a way of punishing those who refuse to stay down. As they huddled together that night, finally possessing the calories to shiver and stay warm, they couldn't hear the deep, resonant groan echoing from the peaks far above them. The snow was shifting, the mountain was tired of their persistence, and the white death was about to come for them while they slept. The date was October 29th, the 17th day since the Fairchild had slammed into the glacier. For the first time, a fragile sense of order had settled over the survivors. They had cleaned the fuselage, organized their meager rations, and accepted the grim reality of their communion. They were stabilizing. They were starting to believe they could wait out the winter. But the Andes is an unforgiving place for those who begin to feel comfortable. Shortly after midnight, as the group lay huddled in the darkness of the metal tube, a sound began to grow in the distance. It wasn't the sharp crack of breaking ice or the familiar howl of the wind. It was a low, guttural vibration that felt like a freight train made of silk, muffled yet unstoppable. Before anyone could scream, the world simply ceased to exist. In a heartbeat, the back of the fuselage was punched inward by a wall of white powder moving at 100 miles per hour. The snow didn't just fall, It flowed like liquid concrete, filling every cubic inch of the cabin in total silence. Within seconds, the survivors were no longer men in a plane. They were objects buried in a tomb of ice. Nando Parrado felt the freezing weight crush the air from his lungs. His face pressed against the floor as the heavy snow packed around his limbs until they were as immovable as stone. In the sudden, terrifying stillness that followed, 8 people were already dead, including Marcelo Perez, the man whose leadership had kept them sane for over 2 weeks. For those still alive, the struggle was no longer against hunger, but against the sheer physical weight of the mountain. They were buried alive inside a metal cylinder, trapped under several feet of snow that had instantly turned into a solid block. The air began to turn thick and sour as oxygen levels plummeted. Roy Harley managed to pull his head free, gasping into a tiny pocket of air, and began digging frantically with his bare hands. He wasn't digging for the surface. He was digging for faces. He pulled Nando's head from the snow just as Nando was losing consciousness. One by one, the survivors clawed each other out of the white darkness, only to realize they were still trapped. The fuselage was completely submerged. They were breathing through a single, thin hole they managed to poke through the snow with a pole, a straw of life connected to a world that had vanished. They remained in that lightless, freezing crawl space for 3 days. The stench of death was now trapped with them, rising from the bodies of their friends who lay beneath their feet in the very snow they were sitting on. By the second day, the hunger returned with a savage, renewed intensity. With the external supply of frozen meat buried deep outside, they were forced into a second, even more harrowing communion. They had to eat the bodies of those who had just died in the avalanche, friends whose warmth they could still remember, while still trapped in the dark tomb alongside them. It was the ultimate test of the human spirit, a descent into a psychological hell that few could ever imagine. What would you have done in that darkness, feeling the cold breath of your dead friends against your skin? Would you have found the will to chew? Or would you have simply closed your eyes and let the sleep of hypothermia take you? For these men, the will to live was a fire that refused to go out. On the third day, they finally managed to tunnel upward, breaking through the crust of the avalanche. As they emerged, they didn't find the familiar wreckage of their camp. They found a flat, featureless, white desert. The plain was gone, the landmarks were gone, and the silence of the Andes was absolute. They had survived the burial, but the mountain had shown them that it could finish them at any moment. They were no longer just survivors. They were ghosts walking on a graveyard of ice. The silence that followed the avalanche was different than the silence of the crash. It was heavier, seasoned with the metallic scent of death, and the realization that the fuselage, once their only sanctuary, had nearly become their collective coffin. Nando Parrado looked at the faces of his friends, now gaunt and hollowed by 70 days of starvation, and he saw a flicker of something terrifying: acceptance. They were becoming comfortable in their misery, adjusted to the rhythm of the cold, and Nando knew that comfort in the Andes was a precursor to the sleep that never ends. He realized that if they stayed here, waiting for a miracle that the radio had already told them was not coming, they would simply vanish into the white. The mountain was not going to let them go. They had to tear themselves away from it. They began the final, desperate preparations for the expeditionaries to climb out of the valley, a task that felt less like a plan and more like a suicide pact. To survive the peaks, they needed more than just the will to live. They needed protection against a climate that could freeze blood in minutes. They turned to the only resource they had left: the insulation of the plane. Using copper wires pulled from the wreckage and needles fashioned from bone, they began sewing a makeshift sleeping bag from the quilted fabric of the cabin walls. It was a crude, heavy thing, smelling of old oil and sweat, but it was the only thing standing between them and a frozen death on the summits. Every stitch was a prayer, a slow, agonizing movement of frostbitten fingers that refused to stop. Canessa and Vizintin watched Nando, noting the fire in his eyes that seemed to be the only thing keeping his skeletal frame upright. They were choosing the three strongest among them to carry the weight of all their lives, knowing that if these three failed, the others would wait in the fuselage until the snow eventually claimed the rest of the plane. The group began to pool their meager rations, setting aside the best scraps of meat for the climbers, a sacrifice made by men who were already skin and bone. There was no more talk of rescue from the outside. The map in Nando's mind was clear. To the west lay Chile, and to reach it, they would have to scale a wall of ice that looked like the edge of the world. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long blue shadows across the wreck, the air turned into a physical weight. The temperature plummeted, making the metal of the plane groan and pop. They lay huddled together in the dark, the shared warmth of their bodies the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Nando lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the fuselage, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his dying friends. He knew that the climb ahead would be a vertical hell, a place where the air was too thin to breathe and the wind was a blade. But as he gripped the rough fabric of the sleeping bag, he felt a strange sense of peace. The time for waiting was over. Tomorrow they would stop being victims of the mountain and start being its conquerors, or they would die trying to reach the blue sky beyond the white. Would you have been able to close your eyes that night, knowing the climb that awaited you at dawn?